Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 73 of the Forge of Freedom. Today for Monday Gun Day, I've got Mike Ooley back in the studio. Mike, as you know, is an attorney and a firearms instructor. And today we're going to talk about myths about gun control or gun control myths. And obviously I thought this was an appropriate topic for this week because, as we all know, there was a horrible tragedy in Maine. We don't know a lot of the details. We know that the perpetrator was found dead late this past week, after having killed numerous people in Maine, in Lewiston, Maine. But we're not here to talk specifically about that, but we want to talk a little bit about some of the gun control myths that you hear in the mass media, because without hesitation, immediately after a tragedy like one that occurred in Maine this past week, the mainstream media perpetrates and plasters these myths on the news. And it's just sort of this routine that they go through every time there's a tragedy. And so we want to talk more generally about those gun control myths than specifically the tragedy that occurred in Maine. And I thought that I saw this post by Firearms Policy Coalition on their Instagram page. It's a picture that says "Ban Assault Politicians," which is, of course, just sort of a counter reaction to the ban assault weapons that so many politicians are calling for this week and for years past. But the post says, "In the face of a terrible tragedy, the state's vile Leviathan wasted no time calling for state violence against peaceable people. They've called for everything from bans to confiscation schemes and more. Their naked depravity knows no bounds. Ban assault politicians." And of course, the Firearms Policy Coalition here is pointing to the fact that to enforce a lot of the policies that these gun control advocates are advocating, they have to be done at the point of a gun. They have to be done by confiscating and coercing the confiscation or the law-abiding citizen to give up their means of defense. So that's what we're here to talk about today, is why that's such a bad idea, and hopefully provide some clarity with respect to some of the things that you may be hearing in the news. So with that said, of course, Mike, welcome to the show. So I guess let's get into the topic. I know you've got a few stories that you want to mention as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll kind of bounce all over the place. I'm not sure what the title of this episode is or going to be.
Gun control myths.
Gun control myths. Okay. Well, what's interesting about this, I kind of bounce back and forth. I hadn't seen this Firearms Policy Coalition. What do you call these now? They're not tweets. They're X. What are they?
No, this is on Instagram.
Instagram. Okay.
Yeah, so this is just a post on Instagram.
It shows my ignorance with respect to social media. And speaking of lack of knowledge, I recently saw Gayle King this morning on the whatever she's on, the early morning show or whatever it is. And what do they talk about? They're doing this exact same thing. They talk about the fact that this is a uniquely American challenge, that this is a U.S. problem. And of course, as we talked about, I think last week, it is not. If you look at per capita rates of, quote, I'll even use their term, gun violence, which there's no such thing. Guns don't commit violence any more than hammers commit violence if I hit you with one. It is not uniquely American. And as a matter of fact, per capita, we're not at the top of the list in terms of murder rates. So
not even close to the top of the list.
Yeah, even close. And what's interesting about this is we're going to talk today we're going to go back and talk about what sort of gun control existed at the founding of this country when the Constitution was adopted. And what you're going to see is you're going to see almost no gun restrictions, no gun control, but you're going to see an expansion of government over the history of our nation. And what you're going to find with the expansion of government, particularly the federal government over our history, and the continued growth of these politicians who want to expand government, and these assault politicians, as the Firearms Policy Coalition mentions, you're going to see as they expand government power, the problems we have, like mass murders and things like that, or other societal problems, generally, at least in my estimation, there's a general correlation between the expansion of government and more problems in our society. Yeah. And I think that's what you're seeing today. Maybe we're not at the end of that, but we certainly progressed.
And that gets to a more fundamental problem. A lot of people think, in the wake of these sorts of tragedies, we have to do something. And I think the best thing to do in all circumstances is to repeal government, to get rid of government, because what happens is government fundamentally displaces families, it displaces communities, it displaces support systems and systems of sort of accountability.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of violence in society is bred.
Yeah, and you're talking about cutting back on government. I think that's a great idea. With respect to the gun control issue, I get this notion from Tom Gresham, who hosts a gun talk, somebody I respect enormously. He always talks about, the gun banners, the assault politicians always want to come to us and say, why don't you compromise on these gun things? Well, what his notion is, and I agree with him, yeah, we'll compromise. Of the tens of thousands of laws out there that put shackles on American citizens, which ones do you want to repeal?
Yeah,
that would be the compromise. Let's repeal some of what we have. You can continue to try to enforce the others, but that's what we need to do, is have a compromise where we get rid of laws.
Yeah, of the thousands of gun laws that have been wholly ineffective up to this point, which ones of those can we get rid of? That's the point. Of course, they always propose laws that would do nothing to prevent the sorts of tragedies they pretend to want to prevent.
Yeah, and let's I want to mention one thing. I saw a little picture of Kamala Harris. I seldom listen to her because, well, number one, it's generally unintelligible, gibberish. But she was talking about something, her admiration for the Australian gun confiscation. I'm not sure what she said exactly, but she was expressing her admiration for Australian gun control. And I want to reemphasize something that you said. What these folks want to do is they want the state, the government, to have an exclusive control over violence. And they want you to conform to whatever behavior they think is appropriate for you to conform to. And make no mistake, they will send men, and sometimes women, ultimately to take your guns, and they'll take those guns at gunpoint. They will point a gun at you and threaten violence and maybe exercise violence to take those guns from you. Make no mistake that that's their ultimate goal. And they can call them buybacks, which is absurd, of course. There's no buyback from something they never owned or sold to us, but that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point to mention a book that we've mentioned on a few occasions before, and that's Gun Control in the Third Reich by Stephen Holbrook, which is just provides one example of ways that governments have disarmed their population before committing terrible, terrible tragedies. Democide, which is killing of its own citizens by government, is by far the largest killer of human beings in history, other than maybe just general disease. But in terms of humans killing other humans, democide by far is the most dangerous. And of course, Nazi Germany is an example, and there are many others as well.
Yeah, and let's go back and talk about where our country started in terms of gun control. But I just want to say one other thing about probably more than one, but at the moment I only have one thing in mind with regard to the main situation, that mass murder. You pointed an article out to me from Bearing Arms. I'm not sure which of the authors wrote it, but it was about one of the citizens up there indicated that he wished that he'd had a gun, and he was talking about, I think, being basically held up in his home, not held up like a robbery, but he was what's the word I'm looking for here? He was basically sheltering in place. That's what the authorities want you to do, shelter in place. And he was so happy and so relieved, and that his anxiety went down when he saw all the police officers around, and that he'd wished that he'd had a gun. Well, when the tragedy occurs, wishing you had a gun at that juncture is not the time to be thinking about a gun. It's too late at that juncture. Yeah. And it occurred to me, it wasn't the theme of the story, but I feel sorry for folks like that who, in a lot of respects, it's their. I mean, they can do what they want in terms of their own personal responsibilities and be able to defend themselves and their home and their families. But I feel sorry for him, because I thought to myself, he's so anxious. He was so worried. That's got to be a horrible situation to be in, and to rely upon the government.
To feel completely helpless.
Yeah, to feel they're completely helpless, and to rely upon the government, they're not coming in time to help. Yeah. They're going to come in time to write a report and do some fact finding and get on the news. That's generally what they're going to do.
They can't be there, number one, in time to help, and number two, they have no legal obligation to help you, even if they are there in time.
So, and I don't mean this is so much bravado, but I just felt sorry for them. And I don't think, and maybe it's because I have too much anxiety, but I feel like that I'm responsible for me and my family. And I have a firearm. I have a firearm on me right now. I have first aid supplies at 3 or 4 arm lengths away. So don't be one of those people.
And it's not, to be clear, and we'll get back to the topic here in just a minute, but it's not paranoia. It's personal responsibility, which is part of the point of this podcast, is to encourage people to take responsibility for their own safety, for their own lives, for their own family, not to rely and to impose some duty on some other person to protect you. A lot of people just want to feel safe, and they want somebody else to be on the hook to provide that feeling of safety. But the fact is, other people can't protect you, and that includes the government. You have to be your own first responder. You are your only first responder. So, whether or not you feel safe is a whole lot different than whether or not you are safe. And there is no, even if you are your own first responder, you're never completely safe. That's just your best protection is yourself.
Yeah. So maybe we got to go back and start from the very beginning, founding, where we're going to start, and we'll end with another story about the Israeli situation, maybe, and how personal responsibility saves some lives.
Yeah. So we're going to start out here with a myth that says the right to keep and bear arms has always been heavily regulated. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But this particular myth, you hear a lot in the media, but we're pulling it from heritage.org, and I'll link to that article from Heritage. But a few other resources I want to mention here as we get into the topic. There's this book called The 7 Myths of Gun Control by Richard Poe, which is an excellent book, and I'll link to that as well. And then 3 books I want to mention by John Lott, who has excellent resources on these topics. First one is Gun Control Myths, which is I believe his newest book. And he responds mostly to myths that are perpetrated by the media. So Vox, New York Times, etc. He responds directly to those claims in this book. The other book by John Lott, which is kind of his seminal work, is More Guns, Less Crime, which of course just stands for the proposition that the more widely available firearms are and the more widely they are possessed by ordinary citizens, the less crime there is. They're actually a substantial deterrent to crime and violent crime in particular. And then the last one, The War on Guns, and the subtitle is Arming Yourself Against Gun Control Lies. These 3 books, as well as the one by Richard Poe, are excellent resources if you have more interest in this topic, because let's face it, in this podcast, we're not going to be able to get through all of the gun control myths. We're just going to address a few of them. So to start with, let's talk about this first one, Mike. The right to keep and bear arms has always been heavily regulated. Is that true?
Well, actually, guess what? I always like, you're a good lawyer. You never answer or ask a question unless you know the answer.
That's right.
And the answer is not true. From the beginning of the founding, there was very, very, very little regulation of firearms. Sometimes people say, I think Joe Biden says, "Oh, how are you going to fare as a private citizen? You got to have F-16s and tanks and all that sort of thing." anyway, it's interesting note from this article. Private cannon ownership was apparently common in the founding era. So, and not so much today. At least I don't have a howitzer in the garage. But anyway, there are very, very few gun control laws at the time. Evidently, one of the few was stemmed from the fact that, and don't ask me to explain the technicalities here, but evidently gunpowder was more volatile during the founding period. So there was probably some regulation that precluded too much. I don't know what too much was, but precluded too much gunpowder being stored in residences and things like that, or they'd put them in a central location. So if there was an explosion, technically gunpowder doesn't explode; it burns rapidly. So for the record, but if there was if there was an explosion, it was at some more remote place where it wouldn't cause collateral damage. But very, very few restrictions on guns at all at the time.
So very few at the time of the founding, and really there were very few up until 1934, when the National Firearms Act of 1934 was adopted, which was a tax on certain types of arms, including suppressors, short-barrel rifles, short-barrel shotguns. And really that was when gun control, or the push for gun control, started in earnest. So really, for the first well over 100 years of our country's existence, there was almost no gun control, especially no federal gun control.
Yeah, so if you have about 100 and can't do the math, 150-ish years of no gun control. And then what's interesting about the National Firearms Act of 1934, if you're 1934, you think about that's where there was lots of gang violence, and you had the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and you can think back to movies, Bonnie and Clyde and those things where they had Thompson machine guns and things like that. So think about that a little bit. But that's what we had. Politicians then, of course.
Prohibition.
Remember alcohol prohibition. The politicians, we've got to do something. So what do? They pass the National Firearms Act in 1934. But what's interesting about that, sort of like Obamacare and the fact they shouldn't tell us we have to buy certain healthcare coverage. They didn't think they could really regulate firearms, I think. The federal government did.
Exactly.
So what do they call this?
A tax.
A tax. Just like they probably couldn't mandate us to buy health insurance. But so what did they do? Congress explicitly said it wasn't a tax, but John Roberts made some stuff up and said, despite the fact that Congress said it wasn't a tax, it's a tax. But that's what they did with the National Firearms Act, and they regulated silencers, suppressors, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, machine guns, things like that in 1934.
Yeah, so the government creates a problem with prohibition. Of course, I've talked about this on numerous occasions. The drug war, that's where that started, creates a black market, creates gangs and all the violence associated with the black market. And then they try to fix that problem by creating more regulation, by taxing law-abiding people for the possession of certain types of arms. And do you think that Al Capone is going to pay a tax in accordance with the 1934 National Firearms Act? No, of course. I think he was actually found and finally incarcerated based on tax evasion.
Not income tax, right? Nothing to do with the National Firearms Act. But of course, at the time, this was basically a prohibition of law-abiding citizens because the tax was $200. Well, and it's still $200, which is much to the dismay of the ATF. $200 in 1934 made it impossible, nearly impossible, for a regular law-abiding citizen to own one of these firearms. So it was effectively prohibition, unless you were already one of those people committing all those atrocities and bank robberies and live and making enormous money. We're never going to
pay the tax anyway.
And making enormous money off alcohol prohibition, who weren't going to be affected by this whatsoever. That's the effect of gun control. Yeah. And you might guess what? Because it was so silly, it had no benefit. What do our politicians and the government want to do? Let's try to do some more of what was ineffective.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I say this time and time again, and it's not really the topic for today, but I think one of the single best ways to reduce violence committed with guns is to end the war on drugs. And of course, you would think that progressives could get on board with that, because they oppose the war on drugs for lots of reasons as well, but for different reasons. But nevertheless, that's almost never mentioned by either side of the political spectrum, left or right. And this is an example that we've been talking about with prohibition of alcohol.
So the government goes about its business from 1934, the next major gun control push from the government, because what are we having in the country? Civil unrest. We're having cultural problems. We're having a degradation of the family. There are all kinds of societal problems. So what does the Kamala Harris of the time decide to do?
Gun Control Act of 1968.
Yeah.
And then 86.
Because we need to make sure law-abiding citizens don't have firearms.
Right. Yep. And of course, we're stuck with many of those today, many of those regulations today from the Gun Control Act of 1968. And then, of course, there was
such as about the point. One of the points of the article. It wasn't until that time that, from in the founding era, we did not prohibit, for instance, felons from having firearms. Mm-hmm. But we survived as a nation. Nonetheless, that's when you start getting things like that, prohibitions on different categories of folks, background checks,
etc.
We see the Brady handgun violence act in the early 1990s. You see this this continuing expansion of gun control,
ratcheting up of gun control. Yeah. And there was the assault weapons ban from 1994 that sunsetted in 2004, I think. It was 10 years.
10 years.
Which of course had no effect, which is why it was sunsetted.
Well, of course, none of this has any effect except the other congruent government policies that invade people's lives and usurp the role of families and churches and other private entities in society. With that usurpation by the government, we see other increasing societal problems. So what's the government decide to do? Ban more guns.
Ratchet up their tyranny even more. So the right to keep and bear arms has always been heavily regulated. Obviously, there's a lot of history here. I think that one of the best sources, we mentioned Stephen Holbrook. I think he's a great source in this regard as well. In fact, I talked to him recently about his book, America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15, and he goes into a lot of the history with respect to gun control. And so if you're interested in a book about the history of gun control, that's a good place to look. Of course, there are other books as well by Stephen Holbrook and others. But the other thing I want to mention here, in the wake of Bruin, which was the Supreme Court decision from June of 2022, there's been a lot of litigation going on in the federal courts about gun control. And of course, one of the things that the Bruin decision did was place the burden on the government to show that there's a text, history, or tradition of gun control legislation that's like the gun control that's being proposed by the government. And almost always, the only gun control they can look to historically is gun control that prohibited newly freed slaves from possessing arms. So the gun control that they are looking to has racist foundations because it wanted to prevent newly freed slaves from protecting themselves.
Yep. That's their thing. And I want to emphasize again, I know you mentioned Stephen Holbrook, but his book, Gun Control in the Third Reich, it's not so much, I mean, it's an analysis of what happened after Hitler became an authoritative figure there, but it also talks about what the politicians did leading up to that. And in some of those politicians were probably relatively innocent and maybe even thought what they were doing is right. But you could see how what they implemented errantly was used by one of the most despicable tyrants in history.
Yeah. So we could spend, I think, as we're finding out, an entire episode on just this first myth that gun control has that the right to keep and bear arms has been heavily regulated throughout history. But the other thing I want to mention, I'm looking back here at the bookshelf. Here it is. The Founder's Second Amendment: Origins of the Right to Bear Arms. It's another Stephen Holbrook book. If you're watching, you can see it here on the screen. I'll link to in the comments, but in the show notes, it's another excellent book about the history of the Second Amendment and the regulation of that right.
Yeah, and by the way, sounds like a Stephen Holbrook information commercial.
Yeah.
Alex, we don't get anything from the book sales, obviously. We just think we ought to do it. So there you go.
Yeah, we don't even have an affiliate link, which we should. But all right, so let's get into the next one, Mike. Number 2, armed civilians stand no chance against modern militaries equipped with fighter jets and tanks So the Second Amendment no longer serves a purpose. So, of course, this is pointing to the fact that the Second Amendment was created primarily as a way to protect the natural right to keep and bear arms and the right to self-defense, but also as a protection against the establishment of a tyrannical government or the growth of a tyrannical government. And so you hear Biden and other politicians in the media say, oh, that's hooey, basically, because an armed civilian doesn't stand a chance against our fighter jets. What do you have to say about that, Mike?
Well, several things. I have to make sure I go through my internal filters before I say it. It works a little slower than it used to. Anyway, number one, if you'll remember what I guess the Ukrainians did, and I'm not endorsing what we've done. I'm not talking about Ukraine at all in terms of the politics of it. But one of the things they wanted to do as quickly as possible to combat the at least once respected Russian army, at the time, one of the most powerful armies in the world, was they wanted to get rifles to as many civilian Ukrainians as they could. I would also like to point out, and I don't mean this in any way disparaging to our military, because we were doing what the civilian leadership wanted to do, but I would have you remember our withdrawal from Afghanistan. We had spent over 10 years in Afghanistan with those weapons that Joe Biden says you don't have a chance against. And Afghanistan was a failure for us. These are Stone Age people with probably more primitive arms than you and I have access to. And I can only reference you to the scenes that we saw in the media and the debacle that the Biden administration presided over.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's a great example in Afghanistan. Our top-notch military was ineffective against one of the weakest nations in the world in lots of ways.
Yeah,
so,
and I don't want to. Please do not take. I mean, what we're taking is any kind of thing that's disparaging against the military at all. I mean, we could have stayed there, occupied, kept that under control from a military standpoint, but there was not a military solution to Afghanistan. That was the problem. It was an utter failure of the political leadership of this country.
Yeah. Well, and that's
in the long run.
That's a whole nother topic. But the Soviets engaged in the same. They had the most massive military in the world at the time that they were in Afghanistan, and again, could not overcome, a ragtag team of, mountain dwellers.
Yeah, and look what happened in this country.
Yeah,
the British Armed Forces, the British Navy,
the greatest nation, the greatest military force in the world,
and our revolution produced a defeat for probably what was the greatest military in the world at the time.
Yeah, Hitler didn't invade Switzerland. Why? Because he knew there'd be a rifle around every mountain.
Yeah, and there were mountains.
And there were mountains. But you mentioned Ukraine. I want to mention this other book. If you're watching this, you can tell we have a new setup here in the studio, and it's easier for me to reach back to the bookshelf. So maybe that's a good thing, or not, maybe that's a bad thing. I'm not sure. But there's this book called Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Keep and Bear Arms by Mark Smith, which is the host of the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel. But he talks about what happened there in Ukraine with the attempt to arm civilians in Ukraine after the Russian invasion.
Yeah, I like your new, what do you call this?
Sign.
Sign or whatever.
Yeah, Forge of Freedom. Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
The other thing I want to mention, too, about this myth that armed civilians stand no chance against modern militaries. Of course, if a jet, an F-16 fighter jet is going to target me with one rifle, of course I stand no chance. But that's not the point. It's the decentralized nature of the armed population. And for the government to overthrow a civilian population in rebellion would be nearly impossible, because we're so spread out. They would have to basically scorch the earth. And of course, the governments can do that. And there are examples of governments doing that. But what government's going to be willing to do that? Because they'd lose all their power at that point.
Yeah. And here's another scorched earth policy that didn't work out. And that's the carpet bombing in Vietnam and Cambodia. Mm-hmm. During the Vietnam War. Didn't work out. Massive B-52 bombing.
Yeah,
it didn't work out for the the military planners at that time.
The other thing I'd like to point out here is just the utter, and of course politicians don't care about consistency, but the utter inconsistency. On the one hand, they say, oh, it's wholly ineffective against our modern military. And on the other hand, they say, oh, those are military grade weapons and no civilian should have one.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So which is it? It just depends on how they are advancing their argument in that particular moment. So I think this is also clearly a myth. Anything else you want to say about that, Mike?
No, except that.
Oh, actually,
the article makes the point that civilians wouldn't necessarily form like some sort of military unit to oppose an invasion, but they work alongside professional soldiers, and that might be the case. That's a good point to make. You don't know what'll happen in the future.
I think this might be a good time to mention a story about the kibbutz in Israel. When Hamas invaded, there was a particular.
Yeah, this is what's interesting. Get me to talk.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to talk about that.
I'll talk about that a little bit. One of the things, first of all, like what happened in Maine this last week or two, whatever it was, utter tragedy, and our condolences go out to everybody that was affected by that. We had a mass murder there. But Alex and I always think about kind of the overall context of defensive gun uses. And, we mentioned at least one guy there in the article had wished he'd had a gun. And that's what occurred to me. Didn't anybody have a gun to maybe at least attempt a defense? But here's one area I'll mention: defensive gun use. And of course, you can go to the statistics. There's anywhere every year, there's maybe hundreds of thousands to millions of defensive gun uses in this country where lives are saved. But here's one example in the context of the Israeli war that's going on right now with Hamas and the incursion or the invasion or the attack by Hamas out of the Gaza Strip into the Israeli territory that happened whenever it happened, the first part of October, I think.
October 7th, I think it was, yeah.
There are these, what they call them, kibbutzes. They're like these, it's sort of a little bit of a Marxist communal towns that the Israelis
like a village, basically.
A village.
Yeah.
But these are very close to Gaza, which is where Hamas, the terrorist group, attacked from. And if you'll recall, there were about 1,400 Israelis, I think, that were killed during this invasion. This invasion is what I'll call it, that occurred. Very brutal attack. And of course, now what we have is the Israelis bombing Gaza and doing some at least limited ground incursions and maybe more to come with the stated objective of eliminating Hamas. Well, in that context, what we had, the initial stages of that where Hamas attacked, one of the kibbutzes that they attacked actually defended themselves. And before I kind of get into that story just a little bit, keep in mind, a lot of people think everybody in Israel is armed. That's not the case. I did a little bit of research with John Lott this morning earlier. I think there's about 3 or 3.5% of the population in Israel that have carry permits, which is down from a few decades ago. So there aren't that many people that carry firearms, and that's just permits, I think. As a way of comparison, in this country, I think it's like 8.5% have carry permits. If you throw out like California, it goes barely above 10%. So 8 to 10% of Americans have carry permits. And of those, I'm not sure how many actually are carrying a gun so they can address a situation if they need to. I would submit to you that this is just me guessing, my opinion, that most people that have a permit don't carry regularly. Anyway, back to Israel. This kibbutz, there was about a dozen civilians there who had sort of a defense plan of their kibbutz. The Hamas attacks, they fend off the attack, 12 of them. They're just civilians. Now, some of them were former Israeli soldiers, but they defended off this attack for hours. They mentioned they thought the Israeli military was coming. They did not come timely, and they kept defending this kibbutz. Interestingly enough, I couldn't find anything on this except there was a one Wall Street Journal article, but you had to pay to get it, so I didn't. But I did find it, of all places, on the, let's see where it was. I'll make sure we give right credit. Yeah, from New Delhi, the Indian Times. Times of India is where I found this article and this information. But anyway, I'll just cut to the chase here and what I thought was interesting. Because basically they're just recounting that they did what I didn't do and paid for the Wall Street Journal article. Remarkably, none of the residents of this kibbutz, and I don't know how to say it, it's Mefalsim, Mefalsim, but it says, remarkably, none of the residents were killed or taken hostage, thanks to the courageous efforts of a group of about a dozen residents. They didn't say Delta Force or whatever. I mean, just a dozen residents, many of whom were former soldiers. These individuals, I'll get it out in a minute, spent years preparing to defend the kibbutz, and their readiness proved crucial. Hey, yeah. But then what's interesting, from the Wall Street Journal, what do they say? This kibbutz, they mentioned the name, was lucky, also got lucky. How were they lucky?
Yeah. What about being prepared is luck?
Yeah, what about being prepared? The people in the other kibbutzes who weren't prepared and weren't killed or slaughtered or injured or maimed or raped or whatever, those people were lucky. The ones that weren't, that were waiting on the government to come. That's luck. Waiting for the government to come to protect you. That's luck. So I thought that was remarkable that this article...
Luck if they actually come.
Yeah. I thought this was crazy that the article says this was luck. No, they were prepared.
Yeah. Well, and
interesting, in this area now, and those people left because the government has designated that area as a military zone and is off limits. So the people in that kibbutz, although nobody was killed, they did have to leave because the Israeli military classified that as a military zone. So anyway, there's a defensive use of firearms by people who were prepared, and they weren't F-16s or M1 tanks, or they didn't have any Patriot missile systems. There's a situation where they defended themselves against. Now, it wasn't the Russian army or whatever, but it was Hamas who were prepared for this and had the support of countries to provide them with modern firearms.
Yeah, and so many people say, and this is a different myth, that gun-free zones save lives. But first of all, that's completely untrue. Over 94% of mass shootings in the United States are committed in gun-free zones, and that my understanding is that also holds true in the most recent tragedy in Maine. But there's no accounting for the number of lives saved by these 12 people at all. Just zero accounting for that.
There were about 1,000, I think.
Where does that go on the ledger?
There was 1,000 people in this village or kibbutz. If they had not been there to defend that place,
there's no telling how many people would have been raped, killed.
Yeah, and you're right. Does that go on the ledger? No,
not a bit.
Not a bit. Kamala Harris or Gayle King, not a bit. They don't think about that a bit.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So the last one, and that actually, we didn't mention this with respect to Israel. We talked about Ukraine, and in the wake of the Russian invasion, the Ukrainian government trying to arm its civilians. Similar measures were taken in Israel. At least they were trying to remove barriers to for civilians to arm themselves. I don't know that the government was trying to arm their citizens, but at least trying to remove impediments to allow them to be armed. And of course, that if they had just done that to begin with, the damage here would likely have been far less.
Yeah, I don't know what their motivations were there, and then. Probably we ought to ask Kamala about that. Yeah. See what she says. Exactly. By the way, I pick on her, not Joe Biden. First of all, I don't think he can think about anything. And that's scary that his intellect is less than Kamala's. But anyway, at this juncture, but she's the head, the new czar. She did such a great job down at the border, taking care of all that situation, that now Biden made her in charge of the White House gun control policy or whatever. So that's why I pick on her. But anyway, I don't know what she would say about that, trying to arm people to defend themselves in Israel. Probably the Israelis are making a mistake.
Yeah. So we've talked about the right to keep and bear arms, the myth that the right to keep and bear arms has always been heavily regulated. Myth. We've talked about, number 2, armed civilians stand no chance against modern militaries. Myth. And then finally, the third one, here in this article that we're referring to from Heritage, the founders had little understanding of how firearms technology would develop and would be horrified to see modern assault weapons in civilian hands. What do you have to say about that, Mike?
Well, guess what? Again, that's false, completely. And I'm not going to try to say what the founders thought or didn't think necessarily, except to say this: I think they were brilliant in terms of their forethought and the document that they put together, which is our current U.S. Constitution. And thank goodness they put we do have the Second Amendment. We almost didn't have that. You had this debate at the time about, we don't need that because our Constitution just gives very limited powers to the federal government. And whatever we've not explicitly given in terms of powers to the federal government, they don't have any powers in the other area. Why do you need these other things that say thou shalt not? You don't need that because they're not supposed to have those powers anyway.
Yeah.
Well, thank goodness that they did put at least some restraints through the
because we know how the federal government has interpreted their limited powers. They've interpreted them in the most expansive way possible. That's not even close to consistent with the text of the Constitution. So, luckily, we do have the Bill of Rights.
So, thank goodness that the founders had
the anti-federalists insisted on the adoption of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. So thank goodness that they adopted the Bill of Rights, and at least we have that as a constraint on the power of the federal government, because they think their power is basically unlimited. If you don't believe me, go read some Commerce Clause cases from the Supreme Court. Anyway.
Now, some would say that the Bill of Rights has been mostly ineffective at restraining the government, but I don't agree with that, even though the federal government has violated the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, nearly every amendment in just about every way possible. I think what's important about the Bill of Rights is that it does act as some restraint, but it also, I think, helps preserve the sentiment in the general public about what the powers and authorities of the government should be and are. So I think it helps preserve that mentality of a free citizenry.
Yep. I think the founders, and one point this article makes, and I agree, that the founders knew that times would change in anticipated ways. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in 100 years. And I think they didn't know what was going to happen in 100 or 200 or 300 or 400 years, but they knew that the right to bear arms were important. And at the time, quote, civilians possessed arms very similar, if not identical, to what the professional armies possessed at the time. Mm-hmm. And that's what we advocate today. Actually, we have arms that are not like the ones possessed by the professional military today. I think we ought to be, I shouldn't say ought to be allowed. I don't want to say that. We ought not be constrained from possessing those same firearms today. Mm-hmm. I would suggest to you that the civilian population today is much more constrained than the civilian population was at the time of the founding. So they anticipated that arms in the regular citizenry's hands were important, much like they anticipated speech and writing and press were incredibly important and essential to the country and to the protection of freedom. At the time, they didn't know how we were going to express ourselves in speech and ideas in press later. They didn't know about an iPhone 15. They didn't know about Facebook and Instagram and Google. But they knew that a free press, free expression, those things were all incredibly important foundations for the sustainment of a free republic. By the way, we have a republic, not a democracy. There are evils associated with that. Sounds awful. I'm going to say that because in the press, everybody talks about everybody's a threat to democracy. We don't have a democracy. We have a republic.
We have a democratic republic. It's a republic by nature with democratic elements.
And I'm going to say something that will probably get me on some list, but the founders recognized that pure democracies had lots of downsides because they don't protect minorities.
Yeah, in fact, the founders, they were very well read in ancient texts, particularly the Greeks. And the Greeks, of course, and it's the topic of Plato's Republic, is what form of government is best. And they knew that democracy was nearly as bad as a complete tyranny. because it's the tyranny of the majority. And that's what they were trying to protect against.
So when you hear one of these politicians talk about people that are threats to democracy,
what they're saying is they're threats to us.
That's what they're saying.
Their focus is on me, the politician.
And they're wanting to pull the wool over your eyes so that they can garner the power that they think that's warranted to them, because they're benevolent rulers who know more than you do.
Yeah. If you don't give me the power to stop those people who are threats to democracy, then we're all you're in trouble. But the focus is on them. It's a threat to democracy. It's a threat to me as a politician.
So like I said, we're going to get on some list somewhere, but we have a republic. That's what the Constitution established, a republic based upon, like you said, democratic principles. We have a republic, not a democracy.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to mention here too is that the founders were not oblivious to the advancement of technology and arms. You alluded to that, but they had repeating arms at the time of the founding as well. And this article mentions that they had rifles, centerfire rifles that could fire in rapid succession more than 10 rounds at the time of the founding. So these are not new inventions. Now they're better today because they're safer. the arms that are produced today are much safer against negligent discharge or accidental discharge from dropping the firearm. They have safeties built in. So in lots of ways, they're far better in that regard and safer. So the founders were not oblivious to the technological advances that were possible.
In anything.
Speech. In anything. Yeah. In fact, you mentioned speech. You mentioned iPhone or smartphones. The modes of speech have advanced far more rapidly and to a greater degree than arms, or at least bearable arms.
Which interestingly enough brings up another thing. We could go on and on about this. My coffee's gone, so that's a little sign to me that we're going to need to wrap up. But I want to mention something. Maybe you can put this in the notes if you'll just give me a minute. I've got 2 points I want to make, and then I'll be quiet. But there was we talk about the Fifth Circuit a lot. In terms of cases that come out of there with respect to guns. But the Fifth Circuit in early October published this opinion. It was filed by the state of Missouri, state of Louisiana, and some other folks against Biden. And it's a opinion regarding the basically, I think, violations of the First Amendment that the Biden administration, and probably even before that, their violation of our rights through the manipulation of social media and the information that we got during COVID and elections and all that sort of thing.
The Supreme Court just announced they're going to hear this case.
It is a great, great case to read. Here it is, 74 pages. Maybe you can just link to this, but it doesn't specifically have anything to do directly with firearms, but it certainly has something to do with freedom in this country. And I think the reason I mention this is it's intertwined with what we're talking about. The founders didn't know what technology was going to be like. They didn't know how we were going to engage in free speech and free press. But now we have all kinds of things like social media, and we see the evils of government in terms of how they're manipulating those so that we only see certain things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll link to that. Like I said, I think it was just announced maybe last week or the week before that the Supreme Court would be accepting that case. They granted cert, which means they granted review of that case. It's the Missouri versus Biden case.
So if nothing else, though, this is a good background, and I'm glad the Supreme Court's going to take this case because maybe somebody in the press will actually cover the evil that the governments have been engaged in over the last several years in terms of suppression of free ideas, suppression of ideas.
Yeah.
Right or wrong, suppression of ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I say one other thing?
Yeah, sure.
We've talked about, obviously, the theme of this is that always the theme of ours is, take responsibility, get a firearm, get a first aid kit. But I want to emphasize again, remember that article from the Indian Times? Those folks that defended that kibbutz had prepared for years. So that doesn't mean you go to the gun store with all the other people that are pointing guns at each other, violating the safety rules, which we talked about. Not everybody does that at a gun show, but I get kind of
bothered by it. We're firearms trainers.
Yeah. So. But it doesn't mean you buy the firearm and put it in your drawer or put it in your safe or whatever and go away. You've got to be prepared to be able to use it when you're probably not expecting to have to use it. And hopefully it'll stay in your safe. If it's a rifle, if it's a firearm you carry on your side, hopefully you'll go your entire life. You'll give it to your kids, and neither you nor your kids will ever need to use that. Just like your fire extinguisher, we hope you never have to use it. But make sure you're trained and you have some level of competency with the firearm.
Yeah, exactly. And so, Mike, we've talked about just a few of the common false claims, but there are so many more, and we obviously can't get to all of them in a single episode. But just real quickly, I want to mention one. You hear this term assault weapons all the time. There is no such thing as an assault weapon. That's a fake term that was made up in the 1980s by the Violence Policy Center with the explicit intent of confusing the general public about what types of arms were dangerous. Okay, they were trying to basically confuse the general public into believing that certain types of arms were more dangerous than others. The other that I want to mention real quickly too is that you hear a lot about, you alluded to this earlier, that these deadly mass shootings are uniquely American, and they're not. If you look at a graph of the most deadly mass shootings in the world, the United States is not even in the top 2 or 3. But more importantly, if you adjust the data per capita, the United States is not nowhere close to the top in terms of mass shootings. When you adjust for the population. So that's an important fact. I think we're like 66th or something. So that's a fact that's generally left out by the media, the likes of Vox and the New York Times.
And of course, that aggravates us because it's factually inaccurate. But we're naive in thinking that the facts are what they're interested in. Power is what they're interested in, not facts.
Yeah. The other thing is that oftentimes these death or killings, murders committed with firearms are cast as firearms deaths, and that's misleading because we shouldn't be looking at murders committed with firearms. We should be looking at the overall homicide rate, because again, that doesn't account for both sides of the ledger. It doesn't account for all the times that firearms are used for legitimate purposes to protect individuals or their families. And like we said, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of defensive gun uses every year. And if you look at the data, in fact, there's an inverse relationship between gun ownership and mass shootings, or the overall homicide rate, I should say. And this is something that John Lott points out. You would think, just by mere chance, that when a gun ban is in place, that at least on one occasion, the overall homicide rate would go down. And it never does. It never has. Every time there's been a gun ban instituted anywhere in the world, the murder rate has gone up. So that's an important fact.
Because criminals don't abide by the laws.
Yeah, exactly. Which leads me to my final point here. I want to end with a quotation that I found from Daniel Mitchell.
I don't know if you want to tell the story, but you're talking about politicians in the ledger. They don't put it on the other side of the ledger. I'm laughing because I remember your story talking to a government politician, an official who was talking about all the fees that they were getting from a particular government activity. Well, this activity, in order to garner, I don't want to disclose who it was, but this activity,
I can give more details.
Yeah.
So I was talking to a county sheriff, and the county jail gets money. They charge other counties that don't have enough space in their jails to house inmates in this particular county jail who had additional space. And he said, "Oh, we took in, I don't remember what it was, $1 million some odd dollars from housing inmates from other counties." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. What does it cost to house an inmate?" And he said, "Oh, I have no idea. That's above my pay grade." And so he knew what they were taking in to house an inmate, but not what it cost to house an inmate.
Yeah. Can you imagine? I spend $1 million and bring in 50 cents a year. Probably not a good investment.
So that's exactly what's going on with these gun control statistics that you hear about firearms homicides. They are accounting only for the misuse of firearms, but not for all the legitimate uses of firearms.
I'm sorry.
And when you do that, the data actually is against their proposition, their proposed gun control.
I think there's a class, how to be a government official, and they whether it's gun control or anything else, they forget about the ledger, the pluses and the minuses.
Just look at the side of the ledger that supports your theory. Yeah, exactly. So with that said, I want to mention just this quote. I actually don't know who the quote is attributable to.
Oh, this is awesome.
But it was on Daniel Mitchell's website, which I'll link to. He's a great sort of minimal government libertarian. I guess you could call him a minarchist probably. But the quote is, "Criminals obey gun laws like politicians follow their oaths of office." So
that's pretty good.
Anyway, so that's where we'll leave it for this week. Mike, thanks again for joining the show. And everybody, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you're armed with a little bit of information to help you counteract a lot of the propaganda that you see in the media. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.